I'd been married to Laura for nearly 15 years, and through most of it, I thought we were happy. We had 2 kids, a stable life, and a strong circle of friends. On the outside, it was perfect. I was one of those guys who believed in true love. I knew we had our fair share of rough patches, but I figured every marriage did. There were times I could sense a certain distance in Laura, but every time I asked, she'd smile and say, "It's just work stress." I always trusted her. I had to. We were building a life together. There was no room for doubts. But then, one night, everything changed. Laura had gone to bed early, exhausted from yet another long day at the office. I stayed up, lost in work emails when her phone pinged on the coffee table. I glanced down at the screen without thinking. It was a message that simply read, "I miss you. Tonight was amazing." My heart thudded as the realization hit. I hadn't been with her that night, hadn't even had a conversation with her longer than a few minutes about the kids and dinner. Something deep within me cracked. That simple message set off a chain of doubts and memories, all those late nights and weekend work trips flashing through my mind. But I needed proof. It wasn't enough to see one message. I wanted to understand the extent of her betrayal before confronting her. I spent the next several hours sifting through her phone and piecing together the timeline of her affair. And what I found was shattering. Not only had she been cheating on me, but the affair had been going on for a decade, an entire third of our marriage. She'd met him, Jake, during a work conference, and they'd never stopped. They'd built a second relationship in secret. Weekend getaways, dinners, and even holidays spent together while I stayed at home with our kids, thinking she was doing all of this to build her career for us. For hours that night, I read through messages, some of which would replay in my head in the nights to come. There was no going back. This wasn't some temporary mistake or regretful fling. It was a betrayal I never could have anticipated. And with every message, every laugh, and "I love you," she'd written to Jake, my own love for her began to shrivel into something darker. That night, I lay next to her, a cold fury building within me. If she thought she'd get away with this, she was wrong. I needed to confront her, yes, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. First, I had to talk to someone who could help me through the shock and find out just what I wanted from here. The next morning, Laura left early as usual, off to another day of work. I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed, barely able to process what I'd uncovered. I stared at the ceiling, replaying all the times I doubted myself and brushed off that inner voice saying something was off. But now I had all the proof I needed. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed someone who'd understand, someone I could trust. My best friend, Tom, had been there through everything. We'd known each other since college, back when I thought I had the whole world figured out. He'd been my best man at the wedding, had watched our kids grow up, and had always been the guy to call me out on my mistakes while still having my back. So, I grabbed my keys and drove to his place. When I arrived, I was barely holding it together. I could feel that icy edge of anger pushing against the sorrow, but every step felt heavy, like I was walking through fog. Tom opened the door and instantly sensed something was wrong. We didn't even exchange hellos. He just stepped aside and let me in. In his living room, I sat down and told him everything. My voice hollow as I explained the 10 years of betrayal, the lies, the messages, and how I'd lived a lie all these years without realizing it. He listened without interrupting, his face darkening with each detail. When I finished, he was silent for a moment before saying, "Man, I can't believe she did this to you. You gave her everything. And 10 years, that's not a mistake. That's another life." Those words hit me hard, a truth I'd known deep down but didn't want to admit. Laura's affair wasn't some fleeting passion. She'd invested a decade in this. How much of our marriage was real? Had she ever truly loved me? The questions swirled, each one adding weight to my heart. Tom was quiet for a moment before suggesting something that hadn't even crossed my mind. "You should talk to her lover's wife," he said. "She deserves to know the truth, too." The idea was like a spark. It made sense. If anyone could understand the betrayal I felt, it would be her. And, I thought with a bitterness I barely recognized in myself, it might be the first real step in making Laura face the mess she'd created. I didn't know if it was the right thing to do, But the thought of sharing the truth with someone who would feel my pain was more appealing than anything else I'd considered. After a long conversation, I finally had a plan in mind. It felt strange, almost like I was plotting some calculated move in a game I never signed up to play. I didn't know this woman yet, didn't even know if she'd want to hear what I had to say, but I had a strange feeling she was the only one who could fully grasp what I was going through. It took a few days to track her down. Her name was Emily, and from what I could gather, she was a devoted wife and mother, seemingly as in the dark as I'd been. I wasn't sure how to reach out, but one evening, I found myself dialing her number, my hand shaking as I waited for her to answer. When she picked up, her voice was calm, warm, and oblivious to the truth about her husband. "Hello? Hi, Emily. My name is David. I need to talk to you." "It's about your husband, Jake," I said, my voice barely steady. I expected her to hang up or curse me out, but after a beat, she agreed to meet at a small cafe in the city. I barely knew what I'd say, but it had to be done. The next day, I arrived early, my nerves on edge. Emily walked in a few minutes later, looking around until her eyes met mine. She was about my age, with a quiet strength in her expression. I almost regretted bringing her into this mess, but I reminded myself she deserved to know. We exchanged introductions, and then I just laid it out, choosing my words carefully. "I recently discovered that my wife, Laura, has been having an affair with Jake. I'm sorry if this is coming out of nowhere, but I thought you should know." Emily's face went pale as she absorbed the words, her composure wavering. She didn't speak for a long time, just staring down at her coffee as if it might hold answers to questions she didn't want to ask. Then she looked up, her voice trembling. "Are you sure? Jake and we've been together for nearly 15 years. He's a good man. Or at least, I thought he was." I nodded, showing her the evidence, carefully, like I was handling something fragile. Photos of the messages, screenshots of the hotel receipts, details that she absorbed with a kind of haunted silence. I could see the betrayal seeping into her eyes, her expression a mix of hurt and disbelief. She didn't cry or lash out. She just sat there, the weight of it sinking in. After a moment, she spoke quietly, "Thank you for telling me. I think I would have preferred ignorance, but I suppose that would only make me a fool." There was a strange, quiet connection between us as we sat there, two strangers thrown into each other's lives by forces outside our control. We talked for a while about our marriages, about the years of deception we never saw coming. She shared stories of her family, of Jake as the man she believed him to be, and it struck me just how similar we were. Both of us had loved deeply, only to be blindsided. Then she looked at me, her eyes steely. "What are you going to do now?" I didn't have an answer, not yet, but something about her resolve sparked a sense of purpose in me. I realized then that I needed to confront Laura, no more dancing around it. I was done with her lies. Emily agreed. They both owe us answers. It's time they give them to us. As I watched her walk away, I knew this was just the beginning. Laura had no idea what was coming, but I was determined to uncover every truth she'd hidden away, and finally make her see the destruction she'd left in her wake. That evening, I was waiting when Laura got home. She walked in, clearly tired from her long day at work, but the sight of me sitting there, waiting, seemed to knock her off balance. I watched her carefully, searching her face for some hint of remorse, a sign that she'd been torn about her double life. But she only looked surprised. "Hey, you're home early," she said, offering a strained smile as she hung up her coat. I took a deep breath, my fingers tapping against the envelope of evidence I'd printed out, messages, photos, receipts from all the weekends she'd lied to me. "We need to talk, Laura." She went still, her face freezing in a mask that quickly shifted to defensiveness. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" For a moment, I wondered if she'd lie even now, if she'd try to squirm her way out, to gaslight me, make me feel like the irrational one. But there was too much to hide, too much I knew for her to deny. "I know everything," I said, my voice cold and unfamiliar, even to myself. I tossed the envelope on the table between us, and she flinched as it landed. All 10 years of it. Her face paled as she opened the envelope, flipping through the pages without a word. Each piece of evidence seemed to drain more color from her face until she finally looked up, tears in her eyes. David, please, I can explain. No, I cut her off, standing up and moving closer to her. There's nothing to explain, Laura. 10 years. You lied to me, to our kids. And for what? Some pathetic thrill? A second life with a man who already has a family? She started to cry then, the tears streaming down her face as she whispered, I never meant for it to get this far. I thought I could handle it, that I'd end things with him, but then I couldn't. David, I'm so sorry. I was weak, and I didn't want to lose you. Her words only fanned the flames of anger inside me. You didn't want to lose me? Laura, you lost me the moment you decided to betray me. You lost me every time you chose him over our family. And you lost every shred of respect I had for you. I wanted to stay calm, but the words came out hard, bitter. She slumped against the couch, her head in her hands. I still love you, David. I know I've made mistakes, but please, we can work through this. We have to, for the kids. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You love me? 10 years, Laura. You were in love with him for a decade while lying to my face. How can I believe a single word you say now? She was quiet, and I could tell she had nothing left to say, no more excuses to hide behind. I wanted her to hurt, to feel a fraction of the betrayal I felt. And I thought about Emily, about the look on her face when I told her the truth, and a sudden, desperate idea began to take shape in my mind. A way to even the score, at least a little. Laura's voice broke through my thoughts, soft and pleading. David, please, don't end it like this. But I couldn't stay in that room with her any longer. I turned away, feeling an unsettling calm settle over me. I'm leaving tonight. I'll take the kids to my parents for a few days while we figure out what's next. And when I come back, I'll make my decision. And as I left, I felt her gaze on my back, heavy with regret and fear. She didn't know it, but the wheels were already in motion. This wasn't just about breaking things off. This was about making her face the consequences of every single lie. After that conversation with Laura, I packed my things, picked up the kids, and headed to my parents. I couldn't bear another night in the same house with her. My parents could tell something was wrong, but they didn't press. They just welcomed us in, giving me space to breathe. While the kids settled in with my mom, I pulled out my phone and stared at Emily's number. The plan I'd started to form was extreme, something I never thought I'd do. But the betrayal I'd felt, and the betrayal she'd felt, burned within me. Jake's affair with my wife wasn't just some fling. It was a calculated and sustained double life. And he'd robbed me of a decade of trust, love, and loyalty, just as he had robbed Emily. I called her. She answered, her voice soft and weary, but there was something in it that made me realize she was ready to stand up and face the destruction. David, she asked, her tone cautious. Emily, I think we need to meet again, I said, steadying my voice. There's something I want to discuss. That night, we met up at a quiet bar. We talked more about our lives, about the secrets that had unraveled the reality we thought we knew. We laughed a little, bonded by shared disbelief at how much we'd been deceived. But eventually, I leaned forward, unable to hold back any longer. Emily, I don't want to just walk away from this without any justice. I know this sounds insane, but part of me wants to make them feel what they made us feel. Her eyebrows shot up, but instead of recoiling, she looked intrigued. What exactly do you mean? What if? I hesitated, wondering if I should go through with it, but the anger pushed me on. What if we slept together? Just once. Just to take back a little of what they stole from us. She studied me, her face a mixture of surprise and consideration. There was a long silence between us before she spoke, her voice steady. David, I won't lie, it's tempting, but this isn't who we are. Are you sure that's what you want? I thought about it, searching my feelings. Revenge had become a driving force inside me. I wanted Laura and Jake to hurt, to feel the sting of betrayal, and maybe, just maybe, find some way to reclaim my dignity. And Emily, with her quiet strength, seemed like the perfect ally in this uncharted territory. After a pause, I nodded. Yes, it's what I want. Emily took a deep breath, and after another long silence, she agreed. Later that night, we went back to her place. It was strange, a blend of sadness and exhilaration as we crossed a line neither of us had ever imagined. It wasn't love or passion. It was two people reclaiming power over shattered lives. And for that one night, we weren't victims. We were something else entirely. As I left her place the next morning, I felt a surge of complicated emotions: guilt, satisfaction, sadness. I didn't know if what I'd done would fix anything, but I knew I'd taken a step, no matter how twisted, toward reclaiming some part of myself. Now it was time to see how Laura and Jake would handle the truth. Driving home that morning, I felt strangely detached, as though I were watching my life from a distance. The guilt weighed heavily on me, mixed with a fleeting satisfaction that didn't feel as sweet as I'd imagined. I'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. I'd taken a piece of control back, but it left me hollow in ways I hadn't expected. The thought of confronting Laura gnawed at me as I made my way to the house, my heart pounding as I imagined her reaction. I didn't know if I wanted her to be angry, sad, or indifferent. In truth, I didn't know if I cared. When I arrived home, she was already there, looking as though she hadn't slept all night. Her eyes were red, puffy, a hint of the sleepless guilt that had finally started to sink in. She looked at me, her face drawn with worry and something else. Hope, maybe, that somehow I could forgive the unforgivable. David, her voice was soft, tentative. I know last night was hard for you. It was hard for me, too. I know you hate me, and I get that. But we have years together, a family. I'm begging you, don't throw it all away. Her words struck me, a blend of pleading and desperation, like she genuinely thought a few apologies could fix a decade of betrayal. The irony was almost laughable. I set down my keys, my face expressionless, and looked her straight in the eye. I know you were with him, Laura. I know about the years, the lies, the stolen moments. Do you even realize what you've done to me? To our family? I asked, my voice rising. And now you're here, begging for forgiveness as if none of it matters? She took a step back, her eyes widening, clearly startled by my tone. David, please. I'm not asking you to forgive me overnight. I just want a chance to make this right, somehow. But the betrayal was no longer one-sided. In the silence that followed, my own confession bubbled up, a volatile mix of anger and revenge that demanded to be set free. I looked at her, steeling myself. You want the truth, Laura? Fine. I'll give you the truth. I slept with Jake's wife. Her face crumbled, shock and devastation mixing with betrayal. She looked at me as if she'd been slapped, unable to speak for several seconds, her lips parted in disbelief. Finally, she managed a strangled whisper. You did what? Yes, Laura, I said, my voice cold, unrecognizable even to myself. I was with her, and you know what? She understands me in a way you haven't for a long time. I needed someone who actually cared about the truth. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her hands trembling. How could you do that, David? You don't know what you've just destroyed. I gave a humorless laugh. Funny, that's exactly what I was going to ask you. For a long moment, we stared at each other, both of us devastated, both of us complicit in the ruins of what we once had. After that confession, Laura crumbled. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands, shaking as she sobbed. I watched, detached, almost numb. She'd betrayed me for a decade, and now, after only a taste of her own medicine, she was unraveling. Part of me wanted to reach out, to remind her of what we'd built, but another part knew that those foundations were gone. I'd thought revenge would feel more satisfying, but standing there, I only felt empty. David, she choked out, you've destroyed everything. I shook my head slowly. I didn't destroy it, Laura. You did. You destroyed it the first time you lied, the first time you left me for him. I just picked up the pieces and made a choice, like you did. It's ironic, isn't it? She was silent, staring down at her hands as if the truth was imprinted on them. Our children's laughter echoed faintly from my parents' house in my mind, a reminder of the innocent lives we were ripping apart. And it dawned on me that neither of us would ever come out of this unscarred. It wasn't just a broken marriage anymore. It was a broken family. Days passed, each one tense and heavy. Eventually, I decided it was time to confront Jake. I wanted him to know the destruction he'd left in his wake, the lives he'd dismantled with his selfishness. I called him up, choosing not to give any warning about what I knew. We agreed to meet at a park near his office. When he arrived, he wore a confident smile, as though he was greeting an old friend. But his smile faltered the moment he saw my expression. "David," he began, hesitating. I cut him off, my voice hard. "I know about you and Laura, Jake. 10 years of lies. 10 years of deceit." His face went white, and for a moment, he looked like he might deny it. But instead, he stammered, "David, I didn't mean for this to happen." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "You didn't mean for it to happen? So, you accidentally fell into a decade-long affair with my wife? Don't insult my intelligence." He dropped his gaze, guilt clouding his expression. "I know I was wrong, but Laura and we were just—" "Don't," I snapped. "Don't you dare try to justify this. You ripped apart 2 families. You destroyed my life, her life, and worst of all, your own wife's." Jake was silent, knowing he had no defense, no way to make this right. After my confrontation with Jake, I realized that Emily deserved to know everything, too. I'd met with her under the guise of mutual revenge, but I'd withheld some of my plans and intentions, hiding behind anger and bitterness. I called her up and told her what I'd done, how I'd confessed to Laura, how Jake had reacted. Emily was calm as she listened, but I could hear the quiet devastation in her voice. "I suppose I should thank you," she said finally. "You gave me the truth when no one else would." We shared a moment of silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. Our paths had crossed in the worst way, but we were bound now by the truth as the reality of the divorce began to settle in. It hit me just how much this would affect our children. I'd spent so much time focused on my pain, my anger, that I hadn't stopped to consider what all of this would mean for them. They'd grown up in what they thought was a loving family, one where their parents shared a bond that couldn't be broken. And now, that illusion would be shattered. Laura and I sat down together, awkward and uncomfortable, to discuss custody and visitation. It was the first civil conversation we'd had in weeks, and it stung to realize that the only thing holding us together now was our kids. We agreed on shared custody, but the thought of not seeing them every day was a blow I hadn't prepared for. One evening, after I'd picked up the kids from her place, Laura asked me to stay for a minute. She looked worn down, a shadow of the woman I once knew. "I know you hate me, David," she said quietly, "and I don't blame you. But I'm asking you, please, don't let this turn into a war. For the kids' sake." It was a strange request, coming from the person who had initiated this destruction. But in that moment, I saw the guilt that had finally taken root in her. And against all logic, I nodded. "For the kids," I said, and left without another word. As the months passed, life slowly began to feel normal again. The anger faded, replaced by a kind of quiet acceptance. I threw myself into work and focused on being the best father I could be, spending as much time with my kids as possible. I started going to therapy, and through the pain, I began to rediscover myself. The person I'd been before the lies and betrayal had crushed my spirit. I saw Emily a few times. We met up, not out of revenge or bitterness, but out of mutual understanding. Our relationship was simple, a shared history and a desire to heal without pretending to fix each other's brokenness. After what felt like an eternity, the divorce was finalized. Laura and I signed the papers in silence, our marriage reduced to a few lines on a legal document. It was surreal, watching her walk away from the courthouse without a backward glance. In that moment, I realized that while I'd lost my wife, I'd regained my freedom, my dignity, and a chance at rebuilding. One day, I found myself back at the park where I'd first confronted Jake. Standing there, I felt a strange sense of closure. I didn't know if he and Laura were still in touch, nor did I care. I was free of the anger that had driven me for so long. I'd forgiven myself for the mistakes I'd made, and I'd released my grip on the past. Months turned into a year, and life found a new rhythm. My relationship with Emily shifted to friendship, a quiet bond between 2 people who had survived heartbreak. I saw Laura often because of the kids, but our interactions were civil, even polite. There was no more animosity, no more bitterness, just the distant memory of a love that once was. In the end, I was stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace a life on my terms. The pain and betrayal had left scars, but they were part of who I was now, a reminder of what I'd survived and a testament to the resilience I'd discovered within myself. I was ready to move forward, leaving the past exactly where it belonged.